Assembly in November of 2012 to represent the 72nd Assembly District, which includes the cities of Huntington Beach, Seal Beach, Fountain Valley, Garden Grove, Westminster, Los Alamitos, and the unincorporated community of Rossmore. As a member of the Assembly, Assemblyman Allen's priority is to expand the California economy through policies that create economic growth. Assemblyman Allen plans to initiate programs that will expand California's international trade and maintain California's place as the 9th largest economy in the world. I think we ticked up a few.
We're 8th.
Yes. Yeah, I think somebody said we were 6th again this morning.
Heading in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. He is specifically concentrating on the high-tech industry and creating opportunities for continued market expansion. Assemblyman Allen is actively working to build the framework for increased international joint ventures and economic cooperation. Please join me in a warm welcome for Assemblyman Allen.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. My name is Assemblyman Travis Allen. I represent the 72nd Assembly District. That's 11 cities in northern coastal Orange County. What's kind of significant about my district as it relates to the ports is I have the OC-LA County line. So directly north of us is the port complex of Long Beach, Los Angeles, which means that a ton of those port workers actually live in my district. First, a couple words about our ports. Ports of LA and Long Beach, as you most likely know, are the first and second busiest seaports in the nation, combined trade volume over $372 billion. They employ over 500,000 people in California and generate over $7 billion in state and local taxes annually. To give an idea of the impact of our trade activity, 60% of the imported cargo consumed in the Chicago area flows through the ports of LA and Long Beach. California's biggest advantages, relative to other ports, are safety and efficiency, and the ability to quickly move goods through our ports with a guarantee that the employees and the goods will be protected. It is important to note, though, that competition is intensifying, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware. The Gulf and East Coast ports are aggressively pursuing California's market share, and everyone's looking toward the widening of the Panama Canal in 2015. Ports around the globe are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in capital improvement programs, and President Obama is making appearances all over the eastern seaports to lure business away from California, in a trend that we are hoping to reverse in many different sectors, not only our ports. Canada is also aggressively marketing its new port facilities in Prince Rupert, and Mexico has put forth a $200 million expansion of the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, which will increase capacity and directly compete with our ports. With that kind of basic landscape and backdrop, I want to open it up to our panelists here to kind of get an idea of where our ports are, what the industry sees as the updates, and then I think we'll probably take a little bit of time. And then I really want to open up the floor because what we're specifically looking for here is some input. My legislative agenda is to increase trade in California. We have the largest ports out there. We need to do everything we can to make sure that we are the most competitive in the United States because everyone else is after our business. So with that, I'd like to open it up. And our first panelist is going to be Kristin Decas. Decas, correct?
Decas.
Decas. I was close. The CEO and Port Director of the Port of Hueneme. Thanks.
Okay, I think
Please,
I
yeah.
have a PowerPoint.
Oh, I love it.
There. This must be what you do. Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I thought I'd kick off just asking the question, just kind of by show of hands, how many folks have heard of the Port of Hueneme in the room? All right, that's pretty good. And how many people can say it? Can we go around? All right, that's pretty good. Well, I just think a very, very quick history lesson. The Chumash Indians used to travel up the coast from Ventura, and they would stop at where the port is today, and then they would prepare for a canoe ride out to the Anacapa Islands where they would trade with their fellow Chumash Indians. And they came up with the name for this area as Hueneme, which is the halfway point. So it was always a hub. Then the Portuguese explorers came and for the Spanish, and they couldn't quite pronounce Hueneme. So you think of huevos, ranchevos, and those sorts of things, and not having a W in the language. we became Hueneme, and we're always a port of call. So that's just a little history lesson of why we have the name Hueneme. We are actually today the 28th largest port in the country in terms of the 270 ports that handle cargo in our nation. And we are the only deep water port between San Francisco and Los Angeles. This turns up this way. So just to provide some quick context about our port, this is a portfolio of the different commodities that we handle at the Port of Hueneme. Liquid bulk, we're a niche port. We handle a lot of bananas, we handle automobiles, and a lot of project cargo and liquid bulk. And just to give a sense of all the bananas that come through our hub, if you line them up, there's 600,000 tons. It's enough to go around the world 12 and a half times each year. So the only way to get a banana in this nation is to import it. So it's a significant commodity for us. This is just a trajectory or a chart of the performance of trade activity at the Port of Hueneme over the last decade. You can see that we did get hit pretty hard like the other ports in the recession of 2009, and we are on a very positive trajectory right now coming out of that recession, and in fact had our highest revenue and cargo year last year in the first time in our 76-year history. This tells the story, if you can just see by commodities, that we have a nice trajectory, positive story to tell, both in fiscal year 2012, continued in fiscal year 2013, and first and second quarter of this year, we're seeing the same strong performance, particularly in our pillar industries of the banana trade and the automobile trade. I think these numbers have been shared throughout the duration of this conference, but you can't emphasize them enough. And you look at the big picture at the national level, the impact of ports are intense, are very, very significant. We move 99.4% of the volume of freight and 65% by value. You can see how that translates into economic impact at $3.8 billion worth of commodities move through our nation's seaports. We have a $1.4 trillion economic impact on an annual basis. That makes up 25% of our nation's GDP. That turns into 13 million jobs and $650 billion in personal income. Very interesting statistic that for every billion manufactured and export, that translates to 15,000 American jobs. And then in terms of overall economic import, our seaports create $3.2 trillion in annual economic impact and $212 billion in federal, state, and tax revenues. So we're a very important part of our nation's economy. And then like we just heard from our moderator here, when you turn this into numbers for California, we are a very, very significant player as part of the makeup of our nation's seaports. I won't repeat the numbers, but very significant. But I think it's nice to bring them down to the local level, too. At the Port of Hueneme, we infused $1.1 billion into the local economy, having our best performing year. That actually was a 90 million tick up from last year. In terms of jobs, we are the fourth largest employer in Ventura County, so we're very important to our local economy. We touched over 10,000 trade-related jobs, and that's because of our strong performance last year. We're up 778 jobs, with about 40% of those in Oxnard and 7% in the city of Port Hueneme that make up our Oxnard Harbor District. So we're clearly a very integral part of the economic backbone of our local community. And then in terms of state revenues and local revenues, we bring $69 million to the coffers, again, up $5 million from fiscal year 2012. So I was asked today to touch on the National Freight Advisory Council. This is a federal committee that I have the privilege to serve on and was appointed to by the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. It emerged from MAP 21, and just as I think many of us in the room are familiar with, but just to highlight the major provisions of MAP 21 are developing national freight policy, developing a national freight plan. This is a legacy moment. This approach hasn't been taken in the past. The U.S. Department of Transportation is also looking at building performance metrics and building what we're calling a primary freight network. As part of that legislation, it also encouraged states to come up with state freight plans, state freight advisory committees, and state freight policies. And looking at Bruce DeTerry, I know he's been very involved here with Caltrans on that. We're ahead of the game on that in California. And we have a nice nexus between our California Freight Advisory Committee and having a strong group of us from California, which I'll highlight in a moment, participating at the national level. So we really have a bridge there that we can tap to make sure that we have a strong voice for California at the during the national conversation. This is just a quick highlight of what we're tasked to do at this NAFAC committee. We're charged with influencing national freight policy and driving the national freight plan. There is a wide breadth of different stakeholders. I had the pleasure of sitting with the CEO for logistics for UPS at the last meeting that I was at. So it's a very broad group of industry-based folks that understand how freight moves and how the system works, and that's coupled with citizens groups, environmental groups. So you really have a wide spread of folks that are engaged and have interest in how we move freight in our country. And I put down here in this last line, DOT goes multimodals. As we all know, historically, we've really built our nation's freight policies around highway systems, and there's a commitment at least the administrative level to look at how we build a multimodal freight plan that has come out loud and clear as a commitment from the staff that we've been working on in this National Freight Advisory Committee. So here's a list of all the participants that we have from the state of California. We have the good fortune of having Assemblywoman Bonnie Lowenthal serve with us, Genevieve Galliano, who's a strong expert in the research arena, Fran Inman, who is with our California Transportation Commission and one of the biggest players in real estate warehousing and distribution, Randall Iwasaki with the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and myself. So we really came out well in California in having a big coalition of constituents to serve on the National Freight Advisory Committee. So what they've done and where we are today is they've broken us up into these 6 subcommittees. So we have the Conditions, Performance, and Data Committee, the Safety, Security, Environment Committee, Project Delivery and Operations Committee. Fran Inman and myself serve on that committee. There's Research, Innovation, and Technology, International Freight Strategies and Operations, First and Last Mile. And I just highlight up there, since this is a Maritime Summit, that ports have a place on the Project Delivery and the First and Last Mile committees. But often these committees will have webinars, and we're able to interchange and work together. So what are the committees up to? We're in the process of building a SWOT analysis. We're looking at our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities and threats in the arena of what our specific subcommittees are tasked to accomplish. We're hearing from experts in those areas in weekly meetings is what our subcommittees are doing. We're also going out to site visits to really explore and bring context to what we are trying to build through our subcommittees. And then we're making recommendations ultimately to the full body that will hopefully get adopted and help steer federal freight plans and policy. So what have we done to date? We had a kickoff meeting in June of 2013. Subsequent to that, we reconvened in November when new Secretary Fox came on board as the Secretary of Transportation. During that meeting, we had a pretty intense 2-day brainstorming session around what we think should get built into a national freight plan. We adopted 3 resolutions as a full NFAC committee. This included support and continuation of the Tiger program. It encouraged full use of the Harbor Maintenance Tax Fund and the drawdown of the surplus of $8.2 billion. And then there was something in the President's budget that would take away a tax exemption for municipal bonds, which would limit the borrowing authority of municipalities. So we asked that that get removed from the President's budget so that municipalities don't have limitations on their borrowing authority and can pursue capital projects with those tools. And then finally, we put a comment out on the primary freight network. Highlights of those comments. We've certainly thanked DOT for looking at this and their hard work in developing the map and the primary freight network, but we do have some questions. And the biggest one being really, what is the context of the primary freight network? What will it be used for? That was a pretty serious concern, particularly with the private industry stakeholders. If you're going to identify our private infrastructure in this public process, why? They want the answer to why. So that was a big question that we brought to the table. Of course, we want to see a multimodal approach. There are, in the 27,000 centerline restrictions, it doesn't really look at trade corridors. We wanted to make sure that they took the multimodal approach, so that we focused on some of those comments. We thought that it certainly needed to include our intermodal last mile connectors. The 710 was left out, the 110 was left out, the Port of Hueneme was left out. So we certainly wanted to make sure that all those important connections to our ports that are trade gateways to the world are included in the primary freight network. We thought the 10-year cycle was too long. There's so many changes going on in how freight moves, particularly with what we're seeing in energy out in the West and in Texas, and how freight moves there, and how that's going to impact our freight systems, e-commerce, all those sorts of things. We need a very dynamic look at how we define what our primary freight network is. And then certainly the funding question came up. What are the alternatives? We're seeing an insolvent Federal Highway Trust Fund. How do we solve that problem? So moving forward, taking a look, well, we have this NFAC meeting committee. We have a 2-year work plan, and it's not really aligning with the reauthorization of MAP 21. So that's a question and that's a challenge, and given the group and the body that we have the opportunity to weigh in throughout the reauthorization process, but we do need to make sure that those timings are aligned so that we can bring value to the process and the reauthorization. Questions, does a 2-year reauthorization make sense? That's something that we're taking a hard look at. But in the big picture, there really is the very real opportunity to have the industry experts drive freight planning and freight policy in our country. And then just in very briefly, I also have the privilege of serving on the Maritime Transportation System National Advisory Council. I have to cheat to say it, but it's called MITSNAC in the acronym world. But this is also an advisory council. It's an appointment by the Secretary's office. And this is really an opportunity to bring the perspective of maritime into the freight policy and plan decision-making. We've often been considered the stepchild in public policy, so this is a real opportunity to bring the voice of maritime to the table. We've been broken in also to subcommittees. In this committee, the Marine Highway Subcommittee is looking at opportunities to maximize how we utilize the underutilized waterways for coastwise shipping. And then there is also the Port Advisory Subcommittee that's looking at infrastructure needs, and it's also looking at the funding. And both groups are looking at how, again, we could better gear up the voice of maritime in entities and governance to get us out of that stepchild mode and into a real voice, both at the state and federal level. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic information. I'd like to add to Kristin's resume, which I didn't get to hit on, some of the highlights. She is not only a CEO and port director of the Port of Hueneme, she's been extremely successful. Total tonnage for fiscal year 2013 jumped over 1.4 million metric tons, which made that the port's most active trade year since its inception in 1937. And also, the port turned a significant corner in 2013, achieving its strongest fiscal numbers in history. And this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing, right? So thank you. What's really great is I hear this, you know, I sit in the legislature, I'm in the assembly, there's 80 of us in there, and there's 40 senators, as you well know. There is not a very large understanding, I would say, across the body of some of the finer points and how they relate to employment and overall economy in California. So to hear this information, as you're hearing this and thinking about this, also think about your representatives, and I'm kind of biased because I happen to be one of those, but I'll tell you that this is a job for you, it's a job for your representatives at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. So in the back of your mind, be thinking about points that you can bring up with your representatives and communicate this directly to them. There's a lot of work we can and should be doing at the state level that I can attest to that is not currently being done, and we'd like to see more. So with that, we have a good friend of mine, Mr. Juan Acosta. Juan is a Regional Assistant VP for State Government Affairs at BNSF Railway. He is a 15-year veteran of the railroad, and he's worked in and around government for nearly 30 years in a career which has included experience as bond and underwriters counsel in the muni finance world, running the largest mortgage insurance business in the world as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Single-Family Housing. That's a mouthful. Serving as Chief Counsel to the California Department of Housing, as well as a lobbyist for the California Building Industry Association. Juan's the kind of guy that really gets it. Juan?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Assembly Member. Thanks very much. Appreciate the introduction that I wrote. the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Single Family Housing was a title that was that Gorbachev had once years ago. So we had a similar start in government. I'm going to talk about two things. CFAC, which is the California Freight Advisory Commission, and the CARB, recent CARB measure that's just recently been undertaken by CARB, the Sustainable Freight Strategy. CFAC is really kind of the National Freight Advisory Commission, but on a junior level. It was something that the federal government encouraged via MAP 21, and by encourage I mean dangled money out to all the states. If you have a freight advisory commission to develop a long-term and a near-term plan, you have requisite stakeholders, there's a potential there for enhanced funding for goods movement projects. So we have that here in California. We've included all modes of transportation, local government. Of course, it's led ably by folks at Caltrans, Bruce Soteris here, and he and Komi Ajisi, and I see Joan McDermott over there, have done a fine job leading that advisory commission. In California, we've probably expanded the group a little bit beyond what you see in other states. We've got the California Transportation Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, Lands Commission, the California Air Resources Board. We've got regional MPOs. We also have environmental groups and community organizations. So a very broad base, some 60+ different interests represented at these advisory commission get-togethers. And although this commission started as a result of MAP 21, it has since been codified in law. AB 14, authored by the previous panel's moderator, Bonnie Lowenthal, codifies CFAC and specifies in law that the commission is to report to the legislature and provide a state freight plan by the end of this year, and then update it every 5 years. And that this plan could also, at the discretion of the administration, be folded into the state transportation improvement plan or program. We've had several commission meetings. We've got a number of themes and issues identified, and working on the beginnings of the freight advisory, or the plan rather. You can see that outline of the plan so far, but as pieces of it are produced, those pieces will be put on the Caltrans website, and I can give you a link to that if you're interested. But I think sort of a glimpse into the commission's work or perspective on this comes by way of comments that the State Transportation Agency, Secretary Brian Kelly, submitted to the US DOT concerning the primary freight network. Commission staff, Caltrans staff specifically, spent a lot of time consulting with the commission members, some of the early drafts of the agency's comments on the primary freight network proposal. So they got substantial input, and I think the industry input on this is substantially similar to what you actually see in the letter from the agency. So highlights of the letter really are that the primary freight network needs to include all modes, not just highways as it's currently structured. There ought to be a national freight funding program. There ought to be an expansion of the network beyond the 27,000 miles that it currently encompasses. Very important that the network focus on first and last mile gaps. Those are critical pieces of infrastructure that may not be accounted for in the current network. To the extent that policy or that the network and the design of the network and what it encompasses drives funding, they ought to allow environmental and community impact mitigation as an eligible project for funding, and add to that greenhouse gas emission reductions as an element of the environmental and community impact profile. Rather than have a 10-year update on the network, Caltrans and the agency has proposed a 5-year update cycle, and that states should get flexibility in allocating the mileage that they're provided or that's established for that state. So there are limits to the national data sets, and as long as you do so within the mileage that's been allocated to that state, states should be able to choose how those miles are allocated depending on a number of localized factors that might not be accounted for in the national data sets. Also, again, something I think that's probably unique to California is adjusting the network and the mileage for seasonal traffic. And that's important in a state like California, which leads the nation in agricultural output and has substantial mining interests. So, different times of the year, Central Valley, coastal region, North State have different, particularly on the trucking side, different volumes of traffic on different components of the primary freight network, and those ought to be accounted for. I guess sort of the only additions on the industry side, and this is by way of a group called CalTrade, which is essentially a group of industry stakeholders that meet on a periodic basis here in Sacramento to talk about policy issues and legislative issues. The only sort of additional concepts there are, broadly speaking, there's been a lot of policy work done at the state level over the past 10 years. You can see it in a number of Senate and Assembly resolutions. You can see it in the Goods Movement Action Plan that John Hummer was involved with when he was with the Schwarzenegger administration. There he is, John Hummer. I say your name and you enter the room. My wish is your command. I wish that was the way when he was with the administration. I wasn't that effective a lobbyist back then, I guess. But so I guess we would also point out that at the border, international border trade creates unfunded infrastructure needs that the feds need to address, and that's something that ought to be part of any national framework on freight funding and freight policy. Also, I think, particularly for a lot of the folks here in this audience, the feds need to address a ports fair share issue. We've got 11 public seaports in California. They really do not get their fair share in terms of what they put in by way of either the harbor maintenance tax or customs, and that needs to be addressed and on both, with both respect to the harbor maintenance tax and customs revenue. The national plan very much needs to address the lack of federal investment in both international trade, not just at the border, but international trade-related and interstate commerce-related infrastructure. And failing to do so has produced consequences and will continue to produce consequences in terms of congestion, emissions issues, and local government burden in terms of maintaining and building new infrastructure to deal with international trade and interstate trade. And as I said, a lot of this isn't new. These are all sort of encompassed in various policy documents that have been either the product of legislative action or other efforts by previous administrations. Lastly, I think it's from the industry side on the national freight policies, the feds ought not to favor new infrastructure, but that I mean new facilities. They ought to look at and actually give priority to existing infrastructure, improving, enhancing the operation of existing infrastructure, rather than favoring newer infrastructure. And lastly, particularly important in a state like California that really has done years and years of work with very tangible results when you look at emission reduction from port-related activities across all modes. You ought to give priority to projects in those states which are ahead of the curve and have undertaken substantial measures either on a voluntary basis or at the local basis or even at the state level to reduce emissions from trade-related goods movement activity. I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about CARB and their sustainable freight strategy. And I did, with all due respect and out of great admiration for the folks at Caltrans, and maybe this is a plug, so if there's anyone from the governor's office listening in the next budget that the governor proposes, or maybe even as the legislature takes the governor's budget and works on some of the policy issues there's a staffing inadequacy here when you look at CARB and Caltrans on the freight planning side. I mean, the number of folks at CARB who handle freight planning issues or goods movement related issues dwarfs a number of people at Caltrans, frankly. I mean, I think we're looking at the Caltrans freight planning staff here, right? Six people. And I'm sure it's, like 3 times that, maybe even 4 times that at CARB. But maybe someone at CARB is here, they may actually know the number. And I'm not begrudging CARB their staff, but I think if we're really going to have a serious long-term effort at addressing freight planning and goods movement, that there needs to be some recalibration of that staffing. In any event, earlier this year, January the 23rd, the Air Resources Board adopted a resolution proposing that the staff undertake what they're calling a sustainable freight strategy. And the notion is to develop a long-term strategy that looks at technology, operations, alternatives to current systems, and approaches to moving freight, and all with an eye towards creating a sustainable freight system. And from the industry perspective, we think it's important to undertake this, but we also think it's just as important to undertake it in a way that allows for and encompasses the complexity of this highly interconnected goods movement system. This is a system that changes and adapts to the marketplace. There are millions of jobs on the line in California alone. So this calls for a high level of collaboration, and it's different than looking at an engine, which is typical of what CARB regulators do. They look for ways to improve the performance and emissions from a particular piece of equipment, and over time that makes sense in that regulatory context. But now we're talking about not only an important part of the nation's economy, but an important and complex component of the international economy. And I think it was Gene Sperling, who is one of the CARB commissioners, CARB board members, said this stuff is complicated. And I think that as long as we all recognize that and recognize the fact that there are a lot of moving parts of this, it may be a productive discussion and one that we need to undertake. But just generally, I think there are a couple things that CARB needs to understand as they proceed with this effort. One is that you need inclusiveness. You need the participation of everybody on the business side and the supply chain participants. We need to make sure that we independently facilitate those collaborations and that process. And we need to create what folks on the industry side have deemed high-resolution data that can better shed light on the goods movement system and operations. And there's a whole host of issues. I don't know how I'm doing on time here. I don't want to take up more time from my fellow panel members.
We're coming up, yeah.
Okay. But just a couple of issues that we spotted early on in this process is first, defining sustainability. And there's an environmental sustainability component, that's obvious, but there's also the sustainability of this industry and what it means to the economy. So they have to encompass all of that. Who ought to be at the table during the development of strategies? How will the ground rules of governance and those principles be established? Should it be a facilitated process? We think it should be. We think the model for that is the Hagen-Smith Symposium, which has been an annual event here in California where we look at technology in the goods movement arena. How does CARB establish a baseline, and what's the appropriate baseline to be considered? How do you reach consensus on some very complicated issues? And there are a number of factors. So when you look at these technologies or changes in the system, how do fuel prices in the future affect that? How do alternative fuels affect that? How do we look at and consider and account for the prices of electricity? Because oftentimes zero emission technology translates into electric powered technology. What kind of service requirements do we need? What are the potential changes in consumer and shipper behavior? Because while we're painting on this canvas, others around the world are painting on the same canvas. So the picture becomes very different from what you think it's going to look like as you go along your effort to paint that picture. What are not only the environmental but the economic consequences? So there's a broad range of issues here that need to be addressed, and we look forward to working with CARB from the industry perspective on those.
Thanks, Juan.
Juan's presentation is great. It shows that there's it shows an in-depth analysis of some of these big plans that are moving forward and the agencies that are involved. These are things that are going to impact all of us. I would really encourage, again, interact, figure out where you want to go with these things. Let's find the best policy solutions for this, especially from an industry standpoint, so we can work on our best logistical solution, because there are other forces at play that might not be in this room that will also be working towards this. So I think that with a lot of the individuals we have here in this room, conceptually you can see where these answers should be. Let's make sure that everyone's participating to get closer to those. We're going to switch it up a little bit, and we're going to go to Jeff at the end. Jeff Wingfield currently serves as Director of Environmental Government and Public Affairs at the Port of Stockton. He applies a broad knowledge of environmental and regulatory policy to assist the port in maintaining compliance with environmental regulations, and also provides assistance and oversight to the port's 120 tenants. In 2006, Mr. Wingfield developed the port's successful Delta environmental enhancement programs, which are aimed at implementing proactive port environmental initiatives, which, as you know, in California are extremely important. Prior to joining the port, Mr. Wingfield worked as an environmental consultant, serving as a project manager on a number of large construction and environmental projects throughout the western United States. Jeff is also a board member of the California Marine Affairs and Navigation Conference, where he served past 2 years as chair. Also serves on the California Board of California Maritime Infrastructure Authority and Bank, as well as the Bay Planning Coalition. With all of that, Jeff, here you are.
All right, well, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm actually stepping in for our Deputy Port Director of Operations, Mark Tellini, who lives and breathes this stuff that I'm going to talk about today, but I'll do my best to fill in for him. As probably many of you know, or may not know, the Port of Stockton is primarily a bulk and break bulk port, and we're comprised of approximately 2,000 working acres on the Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel, and we are located approximately 70 miles east of the Golden Gate Bridge, right along I-5, and we are also met there by both UP and BNSF railroads. Today here, though, I am here to talk about the M580 project, which has been a very interesting project for us to work on this past year, and a very exciting project. We have a lot of faith, and we've put a lot of effort into this project. Briefly, the port celebrated its 80th anniversary this past year, and we recently got into the container business through this M580 project. And the idea is to remove trucks and the conventional way of moving goods to and from the Bay Area by putting them on barges in Stockton, and that has allowed us to eliminate a lot of truck trips, a lot of congestion, air quality emission benefits, and safety improvements on the roads as well. So just to give a brief update, we started in 2013. This project's been ongoing for a couple of years while we got things set up. It was born with a grant from the Maritime Administration and the Department of Transportation, and it was an effort between the ports of Oakland, Port of Stockton, and Port of West Sacramento. The first leg of the project was the Port of Stockton to Oakland leg, and we started that, like I said, in June. And it was slow at the beginning. You know, there was a lot of attitudinal changes that needed to happen, and until we started to see some of the things that, you know, like the CARB truck regulation that eliminated approximately 800 trucks from the road this past year. We started seeing some other things like the BART strikes and things like that really increased congestion. They drove some cargo to us, and so we were able to get those trucks off the road, put them on barges, and get them down to Oakland, and vice versa. So far through From June of 2013, we have shipped approximately 7,000 TEUs, equaling about 75,000 metric tons. And we have eliminated approximately 700,000 pounds of diesel particulate matter, greenhouse gases, reactive organic gases, and other pollutants. At the outset, the investment was a $30 million grant that we got from MARAD, and the investment went to purchase of 2 cranes, 2 Libera cranes, and the establishment of a container yard in Stockton, as we were not accustomed to dealing with containers. We also purchased 2 log barges and converted them to carry containers, and set up a contract with Brusco Tug to operate the service on the water. As we've seen and heard over the last couple days, it's becoming important to get creative. If any of you have driven across I-580 in that congestion and seen how many trucks are on the road, it's pretty obvious that we need to look for other ways to move goods, especially with some of the population increases that we're going to see, and people talking yesterday about those people are going to need stuff, and transporting them to and from the Bay Area under the existing method is not beneficial as it could be. So we propose to move forward with this M580 project. There are a lot of benefits to it. We, as the Port of Stockton, we're still trying to make money at the project, but there are a series of indicators that are showing us that things are picking up. And we have moved, I believe in January, we had moved 225 containers per week, versus when we started in July, we were moving about 60 containers per week. So I think if anything, we've proved that the model works. We appreciate MARAD and their staff and their support throughout this project. And there are other projects in the works like the M5 that I know is looking for a model that works. And we can say that the model does work. And we have helped kind of to work out the bugs, as Dave Hull was talking to me about earlier. And we think this is the future and a great option for goods movement in California. Thank you.
Excellent.
Lastly, before we hopefully open up for a couple of questions from the floor, we have David Hull, the Executive Director of the California Maritime Infrastructure Authority. Following a 16-year career as Port Director and CEO of the Port of Humboldt Bay in Northern California, David is now President of David Hull and Associates, a firm specializing in coastal project development. Been active for decades. Currently, we have President of, Dave, want to confirm, you're currently the President of the California Association of Port Authorities.
Those are all
is that correct?
passed.
These are all passed, okay. These are past distinctions. Thank you very much, I appreciate that. President of the California Association of Port Authorities, Chair of the California Marine Affairs and Navigation Conference, Board Member of the American Association of Port Authorities, Director on the Board of the North Coast Railroad Authority, and serving for 10 years as Chair for the Harbor Safety Committee of Humboldt Bay. In addition, Mr. Hull is this year's Symposium co-chair and has served as co-chair or co-chair of the event since 2010. David is also presently the Executive Director of the California Maritime Infrastructure Authority, a joint powers authority formed by the state of California to provide an alternative funding mechanism for improving California's maritime infrastructure. Mr. David Hull.
See, and you just thought I was a pretty face yesterday, right? Okay, let me kind of roll through this pretty quick because I know I'm standing between all of us and lunch here. Some of us have been working on harbor maintenance tax reform for probably the better part of 10 years. You heard Leslie Blakey yesterday allude to some of the factors, some of the things that are going on in the current harbor maintenance tax reform effort. I'm going to put a little more meat on the bones here and give you a little more of a story to that whole thing. So let's go ahead and get started with just a little tiny bit of a history here. So as most of you probably know, the harbor maintenance tax was created through the Water Resources Development Act of 1986. It was originally defined as an excise tax on the value of imports and exports. There was some legal trouble with that, so it ended up not too soon after 86 becoming on imports only. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund was set up as an account in the U.S. Treasury to house those tax receipts. The intended purpose of the harbor maintenance tax was basically to fund the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' efforts to do operations and maintenance at federally authorized channels and projects in the United States. Those activities, pretty narrow focus of what those funds could be spent for, but they were dedicated to that in the bill. Maintenance dredging, dredge material disposal areas, jetties and breakwaters, and of course the navigation studies that go with all of those kind of things. The appropriations for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund are primarily used by the Corps of Engineers to carry out those federally mandated obligations. The current status of the fund, the numbers kind of move around a little bit, but it's kind of like what position California is in the world economy. The approximately $1.6 billion a year is collected in harbor maintenance tax from throughout the United States. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund has a balance of between 7 and 8.2 billion, right? It's somewhere, it's a lot of money somewhere. But only approximately 850 million a year is spent on these federal obligations. The present impact of the harbor maintenance tax on California's ports, the harbor maintenance funds that could come through the tax are important to all the deep water ports in California, basically. There's some that don't need a lot of maintenance activities, but certainly the Redwood cities and the Oaklands and the Humboldt Bays, all those need access to these through the Corps of Engineers. The ports generate in California about $400 million toward that $1.6 billion, so it's a huge sum that California ports contribute to this tax each year. The need, though, in California to get some of that money back is only about $170 million, and as we've been reminded many times by OMB, California is a donor state, so that's okay as long as we're covered with things. However, we only receive about $50 million a year from that to meet the federal obligations. Problems kind of in two pieces with some extra issues. Only about half of the harbor maintenance tax that's collected, as you can see, gets spent at the federal level on its intended purpose, to fund the Corps of Engineers operation maintenance activities. The rest of it is for deficit reduction, is what they've couched it for quite a while. Secondly, California ports generate more than twice what their need is, but we receive only about 30% of what we need out of that. So just to put that in simple terms, California generates 400 million of it. We need 170. We only get back 50. So it's pretty simple arithmetic. So we're not really getting our share back. Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is another interesting issue. It's not unlike a lot of other trust funds that the federal government has. It should have a huge balance that should have been already used by all of us and through the Corps of Engineers. But technically, there really is no account at the Treasury that has $7 billion in it. It's one of those there's no trust in the trust fund kind of thing. And on top of all those issues, there is still an issue that's been an issue since 1986, and it is actually more prevalent now than it was back in that era, and that the fact that we have a harbor maintenance tax at all in the United States makes us less competitive with Canada and Mexico. And as Canada and Mexico grow, they find now that shippers can avoid the United States by going to those places, unload the cargo there, and rail or truck it into the United States without having to pay the harbor maintenance tax. So we've, just by virtue of having the tax at all, we've given an incentive to send cargo to some other countries. Solution should be really simple to this whole thing. Congress and OMB should just say, oh, let's spend all the money that we collected just like the law said, and do what we said we were going to do with it. Well, that doesn't work. So over the past 10 years, there's been mostly 10 years, there's been a real concerted effort by a number of organizations to try and reform that, to make that harbor maintenance tax do what it was intended to do. There's been a bunch of groups that have been involved in trying to reform this thing. Pretty much nationwide, there's been port and harbor and business associations, labor associations, things like this, all across the country that have tried to make some reforms to this. In California, the real active participants have been the California Association of Port Authorities, CMAQ, CalMITSAC, the state of California itself, and a bunch of others. There's another group that's called the RAMP Coalition. That's a national organization of business interests in ports and harbors. Truly, again, a national organization. RAMP stands for Realize America's Maritime Promise. And of course, there's, just over that 10 years, there's dozens and dozens of former and sitting congresspeople that have been trying to work on this too. The attempted solutions that they've looked at fit into several categories. The first one was, and this was in the early days, just going and saying, gosh, OMB, why don't we just spend this for what it's for? And that didn't work. Another WRDA amendment to clarify the original WRDA is something that has some legs. I'll talk about it in a minute here. And so that's something that's a viable alternative. Third one, they're taking the harbor maintenance tax off budget through a point of order procedure that allows the appropriations tied to the trust fund is a kind of an artful approach to keep it from having to be scored. If you're familiar with the way federal government kind of appropriates money for things, you're going to take money from something, you have to, you add money to it, you have to, replace it. So it's kind of an odd thing since the harbor maintenance tax, they're sort of taking it from themselves. So scoring it doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, this is one artful way to get over that. And then just standalone legislation, some kind of legislation just aimed at reforming the harbor maintenance tax or getting around some of those things. So where are we today? Lots of stuff on here. This is the WRDA amendment. There's actually, right now, as Leslie mentioned, there's both the House and the Senate have versions from a year ago that are still in process to make a new WRDA. But the trouble is both of the House and the Senate both have different fixes to how to reform the harbor maintenance tax. The House one really has a couple of interesting things. It wants to ramp up the harbor maintenance tax expenditures. Remember, we're only about 50% now. They want to go to 60% this year and ramp up to about 80% in 2014. Where's the other 20% go? It's not really clear. The other thing the House proposes is in their legislation would be to expand the uses of the harbor maintenance tax. And that's something that, remember there was a real narrow list of what was originally intended for that to be used. It's been real problematic for the ports and harbors in the United States to get behind expanding that use and kind of diluting the funds that would actually go toward the actual navigation maintenance. The Senate bill, it really starts with a different approach. It says, okay, we're going to spend $1 billion. Right now, remember, we're only spending around $800 million. We're going to spend $1 billion in 2014, then we're going to ramp up $100 million a year until we get to 2020. That technically makes the $1.6 billion that we've got, and it doesn't build in any kind of growth or anything by having those set levels, so it's hard to see if that's going to work or not. It also says that there's a dedicated amount of 80% that should go toward high-use ports. So it kind of puts a ceiling on that. That's a little problematic also. Partly for the next one there in the green there, because both bills recognize that there's that small ports, less than 1 million tons, that are really important to the economy, but they're really underfunded as far as things go. The House bill wants to kind of spread the money around evenly, which is something that's pretty widely supported. The Senate bill really says, well, we're only going to spend money on the low-use ports once the high-use needs are satisfied. So that that might be code for the low-use ports are never going to get anything out of it. So the rumor is that the WRDA conferees they're working together. They've got a bill hammered out. Hopefully, we'll find out about that in about a few weeks. Is what we think. A little bit more on WRDA. What most of the supporters of WRDA say is that we just want the full appropriations, all the harbor maintenance taxes collected to go toward its intended use. That's number one. Number two is that all the ports, large and small, have equal access to those funds. Third is there's no expansion of the allowed uses, so it's narrowed to those navigation things that we talked about. And then that there's some kind of mechanism to release that $7 billion, if anybody can find it, in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Get that back into the system. Ramp Coalition. They've introduced the Senate and the House members have introduced legislation a year ago, back in, it was, February of 13, that has 36 co-sponsors. It's aimed primarily at restoring only the future harbor maintenance tax back to its use. It doesn't really look at the trust fund at all or its uses. Bipartisan, broad support, although LegTrack says it only has a 7% chance of success. Independent legislation. Senators Murray and Cantwell have introduced a bill that's called the Maritime Goods Movement Act. And it does a lot of things. It has a lot of intentions toward trying to level the playing fields across the nation and on some international issues. But it does reach and propose the full spending of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. It sets aside a permanent 8% of the taxes that are collected for low-use ports, so there's actually some guaranteed money for the low-use ports, and it's rolling along. There's apparently a House bill that's going to be a partner to this that's coming along soon also. I think it's, and you've heard this from several other speakers, see how interwoven some of these talks are and some of these subjects are in California here. I think it is time for California to take the bull by the horns and start working on our own. The harbor maintenance tax is something that's needs to be, state of California needs to continue to be vigilant and diligent on pushing the federal government to make these reforms and get this thing done. But California, back in the 60s, and then of course in 2006 with Prop 1B, we made some major investments in our infrastructure and the maritime piece of that also. And I think it's time again for us to do another infrastructure funding program of some kind in California. You've heard that from other speakers here too. One of the ideas tying the harbor maintenance fund, harbor maintenance tax to some of the this growth would be something that's actually an old idea that maybe it's time's back again. This was an idea of sort of a cost share program, if you will, that was originally 14 years ago modeled after an old clean water grant program where the Corps of Engineers on a project needs to split the project, the construction by what it is. Sometimes it's 65% the federal government will pay for on a deepening project, 35% goes to the local sponsor. A lot of times that local sponsor is a harbor or port authority or a county or a city, and sometimes that's a daunting task to find that amount of money. So having the, yes, Bruce? I'm almost done. You started late. Continue. As I was saying, so this idea would be to take that, so the federal government pays 65% in this case. They would split the 35%, half state, half local agency, making it a lot more attainable for the local agency to actually get the project done, having the state have some skin in the game. We want to continue to engage the harbor maintenance tax, harbor maintenance trust fund reforms by the state of California. And again, I think the state of California ought to get together with those agencies, those associations in the state that are dedicated toward working on this, the CAPAs, the CMAQs, the CalMITSACs, the freight advisory committees, and come up with a new infrastructure funding program for California. Thanks.
I think we're going to bypass questions because I think everyone's kind of waiting for lunch here. All of our panelists, I believe, will also be at the lunch as well, so please feel free to ask them the questions on your own time. I'd give you one last note. As a legislator, I am a freshman legislator, which means I get to take all of the meetings from every association. And we got most of them done last year or so, it would seem. And we get to kind of cherry pick the ones we want to do now, which is really nice. I see a number of associations that come in and tell me about issues. We've heard the universe of issues we've just heard of in this panel is very, very broad, as you can tell. And these are substantive issues. I get these associations coming in and lobbying me about, let's do this or let's do that, et cetera. and realize I'm one of 25 on the Republican side, and there's 55 Dems on the other side, and we actually have to get together on most of these things to pass things. The one thing that I would point out is that there is power that you can grant your associations inside and outside the buildings. This is your funding of your various associations. If you're serious about improving your lot in life, the lot of California's ports, our infrastructure, and how the logistics chain works in California for the betterment of all of us, think very seriously about funding your organizations and then doubling, tripling, quadrupling, multiplying by 10 this funding. The larger your voice and the stronger your associations are, the closer to reality we're going to get on a lot of these issues we're looking at today. And these are big issues. So I have 11 more years to deal with them with you, and I'm looking forward to all of that. I'm Travis Allen. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Assembly Member Allen and the rest of the panel. Very much appreciated. Great discussion.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Hold your seats for a minute. Hold your seats for a minute. Do we have Norman Fassler-Katz in the audience? Where are you? Come on up here for a minute. And Brian, where are you? Come on up. No. Yeah,
I got the hardware right here.
do this here.
Well, in the essence of keeping the program on time, and I am a man of few remarks. I only work for an elected official, and unfortunately he couldn't be here, and that's Congressman John Garamendi. Upon hearing of Norm's retirement, yeah, it's all right. It's always working hard for the maritime industry. And in that vein, the congressman wanted to congratulate Norm on a long overdue retirement and wanted to thank him for all his hard work through the years and advocating for California's goods movement industry and all of our ports throughout the state, up here in the north and down south. So while the congressman couldn't be with us today, and you're certainly deserving of a congressional record, we wanted to make sure that we got you a little something until we can get that into the record. So I'm here to present a commendation on behalf of the congressman, the 3rd Congressional District, and I'll go ahead and say for the House T&I Committee, Subcommittee of Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation. Norm, thank you for all your years of hard work, and undoubtedly will always remain an influential figure in the maritime industry here in California.
Okay, now it's time for lunch. So you'll find your lunches out the main door there to the port side.